Cool, let's get started. Good morning, TechNet Cyber. Thank you all for attending, especially our panelists. Some of who have come all the way from Virginia Beach, New York City. Really appreciate it. So, welcome you to Supply Chain Cybersecurity panel. My name is Shivaji Sengupta. I'm the CEO of Nextkey Magnus. I'm also part of the AFCEA board and Homeland Security committees. This panel is a follow-on from the AFCEA white paper on supply chain cybersecurity, which was co-authored by Maria and myself. And at that time, it seemed obvious choice to put together this panel to specifically address some questions that the industry and our colleagues in the government might have. So when folks think about cybersecurity, they most often think about securing the network, software, digital assets against cyber attacks and data breaches. But the supply chain, whether a traditional manufacturer or service provider supply chain or the data supply chain relied on by most companies, is also vulnerable to security risks. It has been seen in the majority of data breaches via third parties. Every company, large and small in the DIB, has a place in the supply chain, and supply chains are evolving to be much of the flow of information as about the flow of goods and services. Supply chain across the physical, logical, and virtual aspects of information and data security is every company's responsibility. And the supply chain as a whole is only truly secure when all the entities across the supply chain carry out effective, coordinated security measures to ensure the integrity of supply chain data, safety of goods, and the security of our homeland. As part of the panel today, we are looking to address some key concerns like, will CMMC limit the risks of information supply chain? Will CMMC protect the supply chain cybersecurity it can't see? How will you address the big question of S-bombs? I'm sure we don't have all the answers today, but at least we look towards getting some of that. To help address these and some very pertinent questions, we have in our panel Ms. Courtney Johnson at the very end. She is the Cybersecurity Director of Military Sealift Command, where she has been since 2014, working to secure, defend, and preserve the integrity of MSC's cyber and communications infrastructure and data residing on it. Prior to MSC, Ms. Johnson served various agencies including NGA and AFCEA, providing systems engineering and cybersecurity support. Welcome, Courtney. Thank you for being here. I think most of us have know or heard of Bob Costello. He is the CIO of CISA, and he has been at DHS for a majority of his career, in one role or the other, in one agency or the other. He did take a brief hiatus to come to the dark side, but I think the government needs him more than we do. Finally, thank you again, Bob.
Thank you.
Finally, we have Sean, who is our brand new VP of Cyber for ACIC. As he said, he's 4 weeks, 2 days old in the company, so we won't pose hard questions. He has spent 30 years on both sides of the aisle, so he brings a very unique perspective to this panel. Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate your participation in this conference, both as an exhibitor and a panelist. And lastly, our great moderator, Maria, who is FedRAMP program manager, cloud strategist at MSEC. She has spent on both sides of the aisle again. Her last position was CIO of Naval Medical Center, which is the Walter Reed Military Medical Center during 9/11, and she is the co-author of the white paper on which this is based on. Again, thank all the panelists for being here. My job is done. I'm going to get off the panel here, the tires here, and get to it. So with that, I request Maria to take over and start the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shivaji. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. So I don't have a problem speaking loud, and if I get too loud, I'll kind of look to you guys in the back row to tell me to tone it down a little. My job today is to ask questions of our esteemed panelists about risk and supply chain risk management. I want all of you in your seats who may be a contractor, a DoD member, or a federal agency member to come up with your own questions, because we kind of have them here and captured, and we want to get their opinions on a number of elements related to supply chain risk management. I've asked all of the panelists to kind of keep their answers to the point and look for actionable responses. I think that's what you're here for. I know it's what excites me. Having been a CIO in the military, having run my own small business as a federal contractor and recently selling it, I can see all of the actions as a fiduciary and the liability issues. So my questions are a little bit pointed to each of them, but they're gonna give you answers that I hope will take you into the future with supply chain cyber. My first question is for Bob, and that is, I'd like to hear from CISA as the CIO, your perspective on the state today of cyber supply chain management.
Thanks, Maria. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I tend to have a very loud voice as well. So I think that from CISA, we've done, not working? Closer. There we go. All right, is that better? So I think we've done a lot of extensive work. We have the Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force that's been out there for about 2 years that's done some really good work. I think if you were to ask me the overall state of it, I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think it's at different phases of maturity throughout the different industries that we work with. I think in DoD, it's maybe a little bit more mature than some of the areas that I deal with. And often my biggest challenge right now is training up my federal workforce to address these issues. So supply chain risk management wasn't always thought of when we were doing acquisitions. We weren't always asking the right questions, and I think we're starting to change that. We're starting to do a lot more risk analysis of what we're acquiring, whether that's software or hardware, and we're starting to provide more thought process on analyzing risk through the acquisition process. That was something that we were not maybe traditionally doing at DHS. I'll only speak for DHS. We were often saying, well, here's our requirements, go acquire it. It doesn't really matter what the hardware is, the software is, or the company profile overall. So we're starting to do a lot more digging on that. I think we're starting to have a lot more partnership with DoD. There's a lot more sharing coming out of CISA through the National Risk Management Center that I think is doing some really outstanding work. Internally to CISA, there's a lot more partnership as well. So, my office was working a lot closer with the National Risk Management Center, the NRMC, on a lot of different issues, as well as with the Cybersecurity division as well. So I think it's maturing, but maybe not where we want it to be.
That sounds great, Bob, because you brought up a couple key points that I think maybe we see come to life. Courtney, as part of the military Sealift command, where do you see cyber supply chain come to life, if you will?
Sure. So can you guys, I'm going to do an audio check. Okay. So, at MSC, cyber supply chain risk management really is very multifaceted. We deal with a number of suppliers, whether it be somebody providing IT maintenance and support to the networks on our ships, whether it's somebody providing OT, which is operational technology, maintenance and support to our ships. We have IT developers. We also have operating companies that we contract with that actually man our ships and run them, or even own and operate those ships. And then you also, like we talked about before, have partnerships with other agencies, whether it's within the Department of Defense, whether it's within Transportation Command, DLA, things like that. We have partnerships with them as well. And all of these, all of those suppliers have suppliers, and all of those suppliers have suppliers. So it gets to be a very complicated problem that we have to take a look at. We also have challenges even with standardization across our ships and our ship classes. So if we look at the OT systems on our ships, you might have, one vendor supplying the machinery control system on one ship, and you might have another one supplying the machinery control system on another ship, and various different people maintaining that. So it gets to be a very complex problem very quickly, and something that we're working to sort of delve into and figure out how to solve that.
Thank you. I think the word complex is the reason we have so many people here today, for sure. Sean, one of the things that's interesting as a large federal integrator is that you see both sides of the complexity from the government or federal agencies, but you also see it from the subcontractors. Can you tell me how you take a look at supply chain risk management from inside your business?
So first off, I enjoyed the conversation just now. I wanted to keep listening to them talk. That was pretty awesome. So it's interesting coming from the federal government and moving to a large integrator, because what happens is I can actually see, I know what we had to do from a federal government perspective, and it's a lot different as you get into their areas, which is awesome, and from a large integrator perspective. So it's today delivering large integration solutions to the government, first off, requires aligning to compliance requirements, right? When you look at the NIST risk management framework and how you can align that to DoD compliance impact levels and the likes, to me, that doesn't change, right? The cool thing about what's going on today is it's an opportunity to add more teeth into the requirements for what we should have already been doing, right? So now it actually, when it's real when we're modifying the FAR, right? So, and that gives it the teeth that's necessary to do when you take today from an integration perspective, delivering services to the government, we're going to go through categorization, right? We're going to go through, you're either going to be modifying, enhancing, or changing an existing system, or launching a new service. And when you look at it through that lens, you're going to be changing an ATO or creating a new ATO. And the interesting thing about the risk management framework, it's managing risk. You always had to look at the interdependencies between the components that make up the services that you're going to be developing or delivering, rather be AWS, Science Logic, or the likes, and what it means if something happens, right? So now, to me, this new process gives us more confidence to be able to deliver better services, because there will be teeth that will require all parties connected to that supply chain to have to actually report up without having to be asked. Right?
I think, Sean, when you say teeth, many of the small business vendors are worried it's going to bite them. Not necessarily that the teeth are enhancing supply chain, even though it does. And so that brings me to a follow-up question, and I'll actually start with you. Can you talk about how the teeth or the enforcement is done as a large federal integrator with your potential partners, subcontractors, or yourself when you're a subcontractor to a smaller business? And I'd also ask that each of our panelists move their mics even a little bit closer, because I can hear myself very loud, and I don't necessarily hear all of you as loud. And the folks in the back and the people on video are going to want to hear you.
You bet. So a couple things. First off, to me, it's more opportunity in my eyes, right? So companies like SAIC, we have programs that are specifically designed to support small business partners and other partners. And it's important because, again, that's where you get some of the innovation. Sometimes partners, small business partners, can be more agile and bring in other innovation that, we may not have thought of. I mean, the cool thing about being an integrator is you're not selling a thing. You're delivering a solution that's a combination of a variety of technologies to complete the picture. Now, as a small business has requirements, right? Mm-hmm. One, we are looking at their rating, right? We're looking at how they rate. Two, we're looking at they are now an equal part of the solution that's being delivered. So there's accountability on their part to have to, meet the requirements, deliver, deal with slowdowns that's necessary from a small business perspective.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but what I hear you saying is that partners of a large integrator should be prepared to share some of their supplier performance rating or some of their solutions related to security. Is that true?
That's very true, and that is part of the process of saying, are you a good fit to be a partner with us?
So I want to go from you to Courtney, because she has a range of suppliers and suppliers who supply them. Wordplay. Can you tell me what you look at to evaluate your suppliers?
So, might be a little too close. So when we look at, we're evaluating businesses to do business with MSC. It's whatever's in the PWS, whatever's. We look at the DFARS requirements. We're really looking at what is in the contracts and what is set out as evaluation criteria. That evaluation criteria may differ depending on the specific mission set of that contract. So if we're looking at a cyber contract, for example, the evaluation contract is going to be more cyber heavy than a ship operating company that's delivering services from point A to point B. That's not to say that supply chain isn't certainly very important there from a data and information protection perspective, but the emphasis may not be as heavy depending on what the mission set is.
Are you seeing some of the suppliers, say for food, materials, fuel, using IT systems that would raise a concern related to the supply chain?
So, from that perspective, everybody's using IT systems, no matter what business that you're in, and we're using more and more IT, as the IT business grows and as cybersecurity grows. We do have concerns about our ability for our suppliers to, maintain the data or maintain the integrity of the data that they have, and being able to protect any CUI or AFCEA data that they contain. But that's why we make sure we put those DFARS requirements in our contracts. And they would be held to them if there was a data leak, and they're expected to provide those protections that are required in the DFARS. We use the DFARS requirements in all of our contracts with our operating companies and things like that. So.
Great, thank you. Bob, my question for you is a little bit different. We've talked about suppliers of suppliers in the marketplace, but as the CIO for CISA, can you speak to some of the changes? I'll bring up COVID, even though I don't want to, with our remote workforce and the supplier of suppliers related to our remote workforce. Can you talk a little bit about that and supply chain?
Sure. Well, I think I don't know that it so much affected how we look at remote workers or the acquisition process there. I think some things that we're definitely seeing is lead times. A lot of suppliers, one of the recommendations that came out of a particular task force was, suppliers should just stockpile more things in the event that something happens. And that's not really viable for a lot of companies, because that's capital that you're investing in. I don't think that that's a great recommendation. So I think that what we're seeing, at least on the IT side with the supply chain, and some of the recommendations coming out of CISA are there are quite fragile elements to the critical infrastructure supply chain. One event can affect the whole country. We saw that particularly with Colonial Pipeline. While that was not a supply chain event, the event that happened there showed us that you had one pipeline that essentially affected the East Coast when it went down, and you see market prices go up on gasoline. We'll probably see significant effects from the news yesterday of Russia cutting off Poland there. So I think what we're seeing is, from our perspective, we really want to help that critical infrastructure community understand the risks inherent to what they're acquiring, and help them secure that, because those industrial control systems for many years, most of our careers, were not as heavily protected, and we are absolutely seeing that nation states want to capitalize on that. So I think when we talk about the supply chain, our supply chain is all inherent to those industrial control systems, and that's something that we really want to get out there. You need to start looking at them just as you would a traditional IT system.
I love that question. And so now I'm going to jump into a question that I think many people are here for. And if you don't mind, Bob, I'd like to let you go first. And that's on the SBOM, the software billing of materials. I have several questions about that, and folks in our audience may as well. And if any of you have a question that pertains, I'm happy to look around and take those now and at the end. But if you could talk a little bit about how you see the SBOM facilitating or enhancing our software supply chain.
Sure. It's a great question, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions around SBOM, and I think a lot of things are still being worked out from it. Having run a development shop, I will probably say, if you can't tell me all the things going into the code you're delivering to me or the solutions you're delivering to me in a modern DevOps environment, then that's a problem, and that could be a problem with your build process or how you're monitoring. There's a whole bunch of things there. So I really do believe that for modern application development, the SBOM should be less of a hurdle. And I think it's also important to explain it too. It doesn't have to be public. It could be just shared with, who's purchasing your software. There's a lot of other elements around it as well. I think the government, we need to do a better job of saying, a lot of us worked on very legacy, older systems, and it may be harder to develop an SBOM for a mainframe application that goes back 40, 45 years, for anyone that knows COBOL out there. But I do think that when you actually take a look at it, some of the functions around it are not as scary as they potentially mean. And I will say, when you look at supply chain, I don't think any of us would want the pharmaceutical community to not know every ingredient that's going in to the drugs that we take. Or to have strength around that.
I like that analogy, but I also think that's why they have patents, so that they can make more money. And so my next portion on the SBOM will go to Sean. As a large integrator, there's a lot of money that is developed and looked at in software and the capabilities and solutions. How do you think about the SBOM going forward?
Well, a couple things. First off, it's our responsibility to help the government meet the requirements that they have, right? The goal is for us to help almost provide the easy button, so when you're audited, right, and you don't end up in strange places, right? So through that lens, it's important to understand, first off, I'm going to say the cybersecurity, increase in cybersecurity policy from May last year, it's a perfect way to lead into what this means, right? Meaning, there's the view to increase cybersecurity directly connects into the buzzword bingo that takes place today, which is zero trust. But zero trust is real, right? When you look at the dependencies between trust no one, but at the same time understand that everyone's at a different place in that journey. And now you say, hey, if you go down this path of compliance, risk management, connecting in zero trust, now in your package, now you should actually have the details of the software that goes into any system that's being released. Now you can leverage modern application lifecycle management through secure DevOps. So now you should be able to produce the details that's necessary for these audits. And it's not just software. I still think we're at this place where, I don't know if you remember this drawing of where it said where software and hardware meet. It was these two hands connecting. We're at this place now where requirements and solutions meet. Because in essence, it could be the ships, the ports that's also connected to the software, that's connected to the systems, and at the end of the day, services have to come out the other end. So I think we're going to start, first off, from our perspective, directly answering your question, we look at how we can integrate secure systems meeting government compliant requirements, leveraging the guidance and policies so you can produce those detailed software bombs. And I think any integrator that's delivering services to the federal government needs to do that.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. To some degree, by centralizing or making available the SBOM, with proprietary code or solutions, even if they're open source code, can be a very attractive honeypot to hacktivists and activists for the federal government. And so in many ways, I think there probably, as we go to implementation with SBOM, need to have potentially more discussion on how that's going to be shared or handled, because it does increase the risks to the government acquisition locations. Courtney, and we can come back around to that on questions or comments, but Courtney, are you seeing or aware of any particular SBOMs that you have to request through your world in Military Sealift Command?
So we don't, the SBOM requirement has just come out, back in May of 21. So we don't have a lot of that within our, or at least the specific requirement. That's not to say that the SBOMs don't exist for our various, applications that we have COTS or COTS products for. I think that I certainly would like to see more of them from a cyber perspective. I think that it's very difficult right now with, the use of a lot of third-party software libraries and open source libraries to really understand where all the vulnerabilities lie in the applications that we have. I mean, take, Log4j that affected everybody back in December. It was very difficult to determine exactly which applications were affected by that vulnerability, and an SBOM would help with something like that. It would help us to not only identify where those vulnerabilities lie, but then react quickly as well. So I certainly see, the benefit of that. I like you, there's certainly risks associated with it as well, and I think that the SBOM data is going to have to be protected just like any other data that we protect in the DoD or the federal government, especially if, we start aggregating them and using them from a big data perspective to really identify where our major vulnerabilities lie.
So when I look at that to our audience, I would say if you're a vendor and developing going forward, you need to think about how you're going to create your SBOM, and you also should be asking the government how they're going to protect your proprietary data. And to the government agencies and even to the independent entities that are offering those up, you should be thinking about that as well, because you're going to have to keep that SBOM listing within your own organization in order to share it with acquisition. Any other comments from the panel?
In on that. Sorry about that. So, a couple things. To me, when you look at the SBOM, it's great, right? It's not, and that's what the great thing about government policy. It's loose enough to provide flexibility, so you can implement it appropriately, right? Coming from a person that actually wrote, policy. No, the reason why I say that is providing the bomb doesn't necessarily mean you're providing your IP, right?
Totally agree, but we haven't seen the details yet either, right?
Right. So, and I'm going to say the great thing about where we are today is sometimes requirements creates a fire, and then with fire comes innovation. And so I just kind of thought about this. I was in a conversation with someone yesterday. There's an opportunity now when you start to look at ruggedized applications, because what that means now is the applications can be broken apart. And now you can actually map the NIAP type requirements in ways that now that goes back to the companies that develop the software. So now this process can enable software companies to actually meet new requirements to the government by exposing and breaking apart their code, but giving them their code back. So what I'm saying is that I'm kind of going to the question that you asked earlier. What does this mean to small businesses? What does this mean to is this going to make it challenging for them? No, I think it creates more opportunity. They just have to look at it as with risk comes opportunity, with opportunity comes innovation.
I don't disagree with you, and I think it gives them new ways to innovate as well,
yes,
with pieces and chunks, and we've seen that before in real technology. But Bob, you have a great smile and you're ready to go forward.
I mean, we have to, there are standards around SBOMs. There's 3 that explain what, how to report it and what is reported. It is not source code at all. It is what goes in to the build, like what are we using. So I think that's important. And it's very clear, too, from what's been published by NIST and others, they don't have to be shared widely. I do think open source probably should post what goes into it. But, again, it comes back to what Courtney was talking about, what's in the contract, and how we protect that. We often have, on the government side, all of us have worked with the government for a while, proprietary information, or, some of us that work for Customs and Border Protection, trade secrets and other things that we had to protect. But I do want to, be clear what we're looking for in the SBOM. It is a machine-readable function. It often will not be, I can't imagine my acquisition shop looking at it. It might be fun. But, from my perspective, if you're doing good dev, you should be able to deliver an SBOM relatively easily. And to Courtney's point again, Log4 was a nightmare, not just because of the vulnerability, but because it was so widely used, because it's pretty awesome. Like if you've been a developer, you've probably used it. But it was very, very difficult for us to understand where it was used, how it was used, where it was deeply embedded, what versions are out there. SBOM won't solve that in a year. I think in 5 years we'll be in a very different place, because I'm sure you struggled too. We were finding it.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And even today, you're still getting new vulnerability alerts that from a particular application that says Log4j is affected by that. So I agree with you that, right now it's not going to solve it today, but as we get more and more SBOMs, as we get that data and being able to integrate it, then that'll help us, in the future be able to respond much more quickly to these types of vulnerabilities.
So, yes, sir, go ahead.
I think if people are willing and receptive, you can become more secure at that, and what he was mentioning from the way that's all layered and the way the technologies are being used from the digital transformation, you have a lot more flexibility in how that's going to be reported, what will be used, and it's the interdependencies is the risk. Once you connect two different things, and you're like, I can't see that because it was in an older application, it's built in or embedded in something that they didn't know used Log4j. That's why the issues with it.
So I hope all of you in the back heard that, but we talked about microservices and the fact that with the labeling and at least the identification, it helps point everybody to the interfaces of different types of software so that you can evaluate your risk at a better level, correct?
OSI stack is layers that layer 8 now. So there's lots of different places. So it's the interdependencies. That's where the risk is connected.
So I want to take off on a couple different tacks that I heard from the panel and from the interdependencies issue. Do we think that CMMC and its evaluation is applicable and helps us to evaluate the risks related to our interdependencies between organizations? And I'll kind of start with you, Bob.
Sorry, could you ask the...
I'll ask the question again. So we're hearing so much about cybersecurity, maturity, matrix, certification. It's the hot button in addition to many other things. Do you believe that CMMC, as applied to vendors, provide a level of comfort related to the interdependencies and risks for the agencies that you're dealing with?
Sure, and I want to be real careful. I wore uniform for a long time. I don't anymore, so I don't want to speak on DoD matters or what they're working on with that. What I do want to say is, and when you look at CISA, we're trying to be a good partner to industry. We're trying to publish more. We're trying to be more transparent. We mostly concentrate on the FCEA, the Federal Civilian Executive Branch, so we don't really touch DoD. We don't really touch Intel. We're trying to help the legislative and in U.S. courts out as well. I do think that the government can help in these areas. We need to publish good standards. We need to have good working groups. And that's starting what you're starting to see from CISA, the JCDC, where we're deeply working with industry. Back in December, we had an SBOMorama, which I thought was a funny name, but there's some pretty good YouTubes on it. That we're trying to be a different approach at CISA for how we engage with the industry and be a good partner. So I do think certifications can be in there. I do think that there may be a need for that, but I do think sometimes as well, there's some recent legislation that's come out, that does drive innovation at some point. I do think sometimes when the government comes out with things, we create whole new industries, and that could certainly be part of this.
One of the reasons I started with you, Bob, is because you are more on the federal agency side, and Military Sealift Command and Sean's group working as a large integrator really touches DoD a little bit more with their opportunities. Do you believe that CMMC helps you trust your small partners more? You guys, I know Sean related to evaluating the SPRS rating. Do you think it's equitable for small and large businesses? What guidance would you give to our group today related to CMMC?
So I think CMMC is a good start. I know with the DFARS requirements right now, you have to comply with the NIST 800 TAC 171, but there's nothing that you actually have to produce and give to the DoD or give to the federal government that says, yes, this is what I did and this is how I did it, and these are my mitigation statements or poems surrounding things that I wasn't able to implement. With CMMC, you are going to have to do either a self-assessment or, in certain cases, a third-party assessment, or even a submit to an assessment from the federal government. So I think it's certainly a good start so that we know that businesses, both small and large, are meeting those specific requirements. Obviously, with this initial implementation of CMMC with CMMC 1.0, I know that required third-party assessments throughout, and I think that was going to be very difficult and expensive for a lot of small businesses in particular, and that's one of the reasons that they changed that, so that there's self-assessments that are allowed under the newer CMMC 2.0. I know a lot of that's still in rulemaking, and we'll see how that shakes out once all of those DFARS and FAR requirements have been laid out. But I do think that it provides some level of assurance, right, that folks are meeting those specific requirements.
Well, I kind of like asking the question because when I look at CMMC as a previous small business owner, I see it very much bringing to life NIST 853 for private companies, right? Sean, can you talk to me a little bit about CMMC for you and maybe the strengths or weaknesses related to it as a federal contractor?
So first, I think it depends on what the opportunity is, right? What the requirement is, because and I'm going to come back to the gentleman up front. See, I can at least, I'm not too old, I can read Jay. To me, when you look at where we are, from a country perspective, we talk about digital transformation, and in essence, when you look through the lens of where we are today, I think we're at another phase of digital transformation. We're not, and this phase is focusing on compliance, regulations, and policy. Right? When we weren't focusing on that before we were really focusing on cloud, which cloud made cloud cloudy. And then it was the buzzwords, right? But now when you look at where we are today, it's really coming back to locking in those types of regulatory compliance and controls, because those controls, the categorization and those controls drive building secure compliance systems. And these standards like CMMC, NIST 853, Rev 5, NIST 800 171, and the likes, DoD impact levels, all drive the controls and the risk management associated with it. So those types of standards of small business or the likes that have those tickets punched, to me, it just adds to, depending on what the opportunity is, it adds to the comfort level and confidence in the solutions that are being designed.
I love it. And Sean has used a couple buzzwords because he's playing buzzword bingo today with me.
That's right.
And one of the ones I heard in our explanation for supply chain related to zero trust architecture. It's the hot word for 2022. I heard it down here. When we look at interfaces, we all want to talk about zero trust for devices and people and entities. Talk to me a little bit. I'll give you guys a kind of a short take. Zero trust with supply chain risk management. Do you want to start, Courtney?
So I think, again, zero trust, big buzzword of the I wouldn't even say 2022. I'd say it probably started a few years ago. But, zero trust is something that we're all striving to go towards. I mean, I know within the DoD in particular, when we look at our networks, initially DoD was built out with a really, really hard outer shell and then kind of a squishy middle, so the zero trust wasn't there. Once you got in, you got in. But now that the DoD is moving more towards a zero trust architecture within our systems and networks, I think from a supply chain perspective, that will certainly affect our suppliers and being able to integrate with our various systems and networks and having to have those requirements and things in place in order to do that is going to be really important. I think it's going to be certainly challenging for if you look at the difference between a small and a large business. You can say small businesses can have the opportunity to be more agile, but they also sometimes don't have those expertise or skill sets in place within their organization to adapt and change really quickly. So I think as we move more towards zero trust, I think it'll be interesting to see how the small businesses and how even the large businesses are able to change the way that they're doing business to be able to integrate with our systems and networks.
I agree. Bob, do you have some comments on zero trust?
Sure. I think to Courtney's point, it could be on how the community interacts with us. I think some of the concepts around zero trust are not new. We've been talking about these things for 20 years. It's just a kind of a new word in phrase. But I don't think that zero trust. I think when you actually look at it from my background was for many years as a network engineer or infrastructure. We're talking about protection of the supply chain, and I think that's where zero trust can really help. It's not just the cyber supply chain or the IT supply chain. When you implement those principles across critical infrastructure or elsewhere, you're helping secure the supply chain. So I think that's something that should be looked at, large and small companies, and there are ways that are cost effective to implement zero trust. And in fact, some of the things that we're doing at CISA with some of my teams are going to result in lower cost for operating those systems than the legacy models. Not always. Sometimes there's a ramp up, but I think that when we talk about risk as well, what is the risk of a breach? How much does that cost a small or a large company? It can be in the tens of millions. It could be factored into bankruptcy. And I think that that's something that needs to be looked at as well when you're securing your data.
I think there are two good components that were brought up related to zero trust, and one is cloud. When, as a FedRAMP 3 PAO, and I looked at cloud organizations, zero trust was actually built into the FIPS 140-2 to the number of identification and capabilities for devices in and outside the boundary and how they communicated with one another. So it is there in place, and I think some of the cloud applications provide a lower hurdle or a easier entry into the marketplace for some smaller businesses as you go forward. We are going to have about 15 minutes, so all of you who have questions, I hope your hands are ready to go up. But before we do, I would like to ask each of our panelists to tell me either where they see supply chain cyber going in the next 1 to 3 years, or what's missing. And I'll give you your choice on how you want to answer that last question before we go to the audience. What's missing in supply chain risk management, or where do you see it going in the next 1 to 3 years? Sean, would you like to start with us?
Well, first off, I agree with what Bob said, right? A lot of what's going on, the requirements today, we have been doing. It's not new, right? But what it's doing, though, it's actually has some. It's directly connected, and I completely agree. Zero trust support. So it supports and protects the supply chain. So when you look at where we are today, I think it's a maturity, right? We are at the next step for one of the destinations in digital transformation, and what you're going to see between now and the next 5 years is you're going to see companies mature in their cyber practices. You're going to see the government actually start to understand what it means to be able to embed better requirements into opportunities. You're going to see the FAR changed, right? You're going to see a lot of things that are going to take place. But again, this is the journey. So you're going to see the whole viewpoint of cyber supply chain maturing over the next 5 years. And I think you're going to see companies mature as a part of that to support the government in delivering services.
Thank you. Bob?
I think on our side, at least internal to my organization, I'm hoping for more rigor as we work with our partners to understand what's being provided and as we go through the acquisition process. I think as we come out of the last very difficult, incredibly difficult last 2+ years of the pandemic, we certainly saw weaknesses in the supply chain across the board. And I think that people are taking notice of that, and I think you'll see a deeper understanding, certainly within the government, of the different levels of the supply chain, and when something happens in one part of the world, the deep effects it can have to the American public. And so that's something that I'm really interested in, and something the NRMC is working on quite extensively. So I think from our organization, you'll see a lot more publishing of guidelines and data for the trends that we saw coming out of the last couple of years. And I think on our acquisition process, we're certainly going to start looking for certain things so that we can, we really do, Log4 really proved to us we need to know a little bit deeper level of what's in the things that we're acquiring. Because to Courtney's point, we're still spending an enormous amount of human capital discovering that. So I think that spurned things, as did SolarWinds, that we're still kind of recovering from or getting good thought leadership out of, I think I should say.
Well, I would say your answer actually integrates very nicely with Sean's. The maturity and the details are really important, and evaluating those. Courtney, where do you see, or what do you see that's missing?
Sure. That point about going last is that they took some of my answers to that question. But kind of going off of what Sean said from a maturity perspective, I think right now, we're really looking a lot at compliance, and are we doing the thing? Are we checking the boxes on the various, controls and things like that. I think what I would like to see going forward is, and again, this is a maturity thing, so once we get the compliance, how are we measuring our operational risk associated with our supply chain, or not only as supply chain providers, but also those risks associated with those, and then how is that affecting our ability to meet the mission? Are we focusing on the right areas, or are we spending time on this low-hanging fruit that isn't really going to make an impact going forward? So that's where I'd like to see it go in the next.
I really like your answer, because I'm a big believer, and I shared this with you guys earlier, risk appetite. In context, sometimes risks can be taken on board, sometimes they need to be mitigated, and I think our approach has been all or none, that we need a certain level. And so with that maturity, I'm hoping that the risk management framework also matures a little bit related to in context, because that would help different businesses and different agencies where they need it. I'm looking for questions. Oh, we have one. Do you have a microphone, sir?
I'll make it brief. I'm sure there's lots of questions. Excuse me. Neil Schumacher with IBM. I run the federal cybersecurity practice. So, Caroline, your answer I thought was spot on at the end. Kind of moving it from compliance to risk. But I think in all cases, when you think through, creation of a bill of material and delivery, or let's say exfiltrating out information properly that can be shared with the government in some fashion that's secure, encrypted, etc., it does imply a willingness of suppliers to engage as contractors to share or at least provide insights associated with that data. I think there's cases that are likely to come as we move further into a zero trust world and recognize that the information that can be shared has some restrictions on it, not necessarily ones that are just a governance perspective, but more about the let's say the exposure of that data to the government in some fashion that would not preclude that data being perhaps lost or accessed by a bad actor, and because of that, I'm seeing suppliers beginning to resist heavily in the idea that they're going to share information with the government. There are some cases where there's major suppliers that the government needs. They're just, big players that are going to be pretty stringent about this. What are your thoughts? Maybe it's for you, Carolyn, or it could be for Bob, from the government's perspective, on how you're going to work with suppliers that may not be willing to do more than say, yes, we can attest we're compliant with CMMC. Yes, we're FIPS compliant. Yes, we can show you we can handle NIST, but we're not going to give you any information.
So I'll start. I really think that goes down to the contract language that's in the contract. So if you're going to want to do business with the federal government or with the DoD, there's going to be things that you're going to have to provide. That's just the cost of doing business with the DoD or the federal government. And obviously, when we're looking at the DFARS and the FARS requirements that are getting rewritten, there's comment periods that allow for individuals or companies to provide their thoughts. And I know that as those things are being written, they're taking those into account. But if we are able to enforce things through contract language with our suppliers, and that's what we're going to continue to do. So, unfortunately, again, I think that's kind of the cost of doing business with the federal government, is that you may have to share data that you didn't necessarily want to share before. But I know that as somebody that works for the DoD, we would certainly do everything that we can to protect the data, and that's it's a two-way trust relationship there.
Bob, I think he was looking for an answer from you too.
I don't think I could say it better than Courtney did. I mean, that's just kind of we are as clear as we can be during the acquisition process, and if you're uncomfortable with it, don't bid. I don't mean to be so blunt with that, but she also brought up some really good points. A lot of these go through public rulemaking. It's critical that companies weigh in on that. I know many of you have great lobbying firms, and are part of that. But we are trying to be good at open government, and there are a lot of open meetings that are required. The rulemaking process typically is about 3 years sometimes. So I think that I get a little concerned when I hear, well, we didn't know, Bob, that was happening. It was public. The wide variety of these things are done in the public. There's a small space done through selective acquisition for classified contracts. That's a little bit different. But if it's in the contract, we will enforce it, or at least have that ability to enforce it. And I think that much of this information, sometimes intellectual property is shared with the government, and that might be required as something. But bills of materials and things, I struggle to see that is intellectual property. It's the ingredient list. It's not the recipe.
Is there another question?
Comment on two questions, if you'll allow. One, if you want a standing ovation, fill the room up with cyber defenders like myself. I manage one of the 27 JFHQ DOD CSSPs, and you will have roaring applause for an S-bomb. So, how do we mitigate the risk of an adversary, either gray or red, from acquiring companies whole or in part after they've been incorporated into the DoD? Is my first question. And the second one is, I've been to many other panels and they talk about rapid acquisition. And one of the main components of rapid acquisition is that some of the required components have to go to the wayside in order to deliver capability to the warfighter sooner. Mostly, though, things being survivability and cybersecurity. So how are the offices, the scrim offices, making sure that those components are not getting dropped with regard to rapid acquisition?
So from a rapid acquisition perspective, I think, cyber, like you said, is one of the things that sometimes does get dropped. And I think, from my perspective, I can put my 2 cents out there. It obviously comes down to what, our leadership within our command and within our intent shop, our contracting shop, decides. We have a seat at the table, but we are not the head honcho that makes all of the decisions. So, and I think you see that in a lot of different areas. It's not just rapid acquisition, but it can come down to just decisions being made about software development in general. We have to get this this to the field within this X amount of time, which means we have to make trade-offs and decisions. But really understanding where that risk base is and making those good risk-based decisions, and then also providing that information to the decision makers, I think, is the most important point to help make sure that those requirements get into those rapid acquisition pieces, where they really need to be. And can you repeat your first question? I apologize.
Yeah, how do we mitigate adversaries, either gray or red, from acquiring either companies whole or in part that are delivering, services to the DoD?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a real challenge. I think that when you're looking at your contracts, you can certainly put things in place, or at least look to see what contract language you can put in place about people that you will be doing business with. So if somebody acquires, a specific company, for example, so say, Russia acquires, an American-made company, where is that, when that happens, where is that risk in trade space, and where can we make changes from a contractual perspective, and do we need to, right? So just because it's a company from Russia doesn't mean it's necessarily an adversary. So, you really have to work. We want to work with our intelligence folks within the DoD to understand, if this happens, what are the implications of this, and if it does happen and it poses a great risk, that's certainly something that we would work with our contracting office to see what we can do to get around that.
Sean or Bob, do you have additional comments to those questions? I actually have a comment for you. I think CMMC and the International FOSI actually evaluates and helps with some of those contracts and the lack of purchases. But I also think that we're beginning to see that our risks are beyond just the technology, and that's the most important part. And part of protecting those companies has to come back to a fiduciary responsibility on the executive teams and the CEOs. And I think that has been missing in the compliance and liability section. Some folks did that, and I talked with the panel earlier. Some of the companies that met CUI in December of 2017 were overlooked as CMMC changed. But there are fiduciary and reputational issues for the executive teams, and they need to manage to that level. Whether you're a small, medium, or a large business, how are you handling those requirements so that you're not putting the government at risk as critical infrastructure, or you're putting your own business at risk from a revenue and a survivability standpoint, right? Because that purchase alone could actually end the whole aspect of your company and the things that you're accomplishing. Rapid acquisition needs to look at that as well, which is the business and the corporate mission and fiduciary responsibilities. We haven't looked at that in the FAR and the DFARs for a long time. We only look at it from a foreign foci.
So there is actually a cross-departmental effort too, the CFIUS process that does look at acquisitions that we all get to weigh in on. So if a company is being acquired, there is a government body that looks at that. If there's going to be significant foreign ownership or foreign ownership is taking over, it's a very interesting process. I can't speak on it as an expert, but there have been the number of reviews are dramatically increasing that go through that body. It used to almost be kind of a sign-off. One of the big wake-up calls was when IBM sold significant portions of their business to Lenovo. Going back many, many years ago, but that obviously created great concern across the government because we're big partners with IBM, and now it's moving to Chinese ownership. So that is something that I would say research and look at. It's an interesting process, but there is many different departments sit within CFIUS to provide input on possible acquisitions by foreign governments or companies.
Do we have any other questions?
Well, thank you very much. That was a great panel. I appreciate everything you guys had to say. I'd like to change the discussion a little bit. My name's Dan Terracini. in the cyber business. I'm a trainer and hopefully assessor pretty soon as we get CMMC off the ground. I'm also, after 40 years, a recovering graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy. I was able, through contacts, to get Courtney on, because I think this is an important subject, especially with our supply chain, and you're so involved with our supply chain, not only from a commercial perspective, but supplying our military in various theaters. And I think there's a big disconnect between the ones and zero people, which a lot of us are involved, especially in the government, and the people that end up being the most vulnerable, right? The maintenance guy that's plugging something in, and we talked about zero trust, right? It's not a new concept. It's something we talked about many, many years ago. When you talked about maturity, we talked about protecting SBU in the 90s. And the answer to that was, in many cases, the program office saying, well, we don't have any SBU. There's not enough education going down to the regular guy, if you will, the regular gal who's working these on a daily basis. We're developing and graduating strategic Sealift officers right now who have no idea what cybersecurity is, barely have computer capability. DHS pushed a TWIC card on the entire industry. Almost nobody knows what's on that chip. There's almost no guidance at a DHS on how to use that to get what OMB is calling very strong authentication of individuals. So how do we get that education down way beyond the government talking heads and the IBMs and get it down to the people that are actually plugging things in, doing the work that is the most vulnerable, and end up being our Achilles heel.
I got a quick primer on that. So first off, I think you're gonna see a difference between department, right? You're gonna see a difference between integrators. Right? So I can tell you, 3 weeks, 3 days in, right? What I'm going to do is I'm actually queuing up. You're going to see massive education, literally month after month, about what this means. Like we talked about zero trust. Zero trust isn't a destination; it's a strategy, right? And when you look at what it means to go through that and what it means to you, so you're going to see, the way to deliver information today is in small bites, right? It's not long, training where people take time out. It's literally, how do you now deliver information to people in ways that people consume information today? Meaning it's going to be in small bites. So I can tell you it's going to be a whole series of short podcasts that are going to be specific about cyber. And it's not going to it's not going to be marketing. It's really going to be educational, because the more people understand at the various levels what it means to them, especially if they work for the government or deliver services to the government, in coming up with that protocol, way of communicating what it means, is going to enable everyone to benefit from it. So we are going to queue up a lot of those, podcasts and educational types of tracks that are going to be very short, that people can consume it and take time. And then, of course, on top of that, talking about that on all of the Fed News radios and the Government Matters and the likes. But it's going to be a huge effort right now that we're queuing that up. Thoughts?
So I think, going off the education piece, I think the key to that, though, is really making it so that folks understand what it means to them and then how it's going to actually impact them. So, I have, a radioman on the ship that is very, specific to comms. What does the supply chain piece mean to me? How does it affect me? Can you give me an example of why I need to be,
I need to be aware of this, why I need to be thinking about this, and then, what can I do in my little space to help protect the supply chain and from a cyber perspective as well. So I think that's a lot of the challenge, and I see that a lot within cyber in general, even when it comes to implementing new cyber tools and technologies, having to go to the decision makers and say, this is going to cost me a lot of money, and they're going to say, well, how much money is it going to save me? How do you actually quantify that? How do you make it, relatable to them? How do you make it so that they understand the true impact of that? And I think from an education perspective, that's sort of where we need to shift to. Don't tell me about the specific technologies and how all these things integrate and the bits and bytes pieces, but it's really, what does it mean to me, and then how can I make an impact in this particular area? And I think CISA does a great job. I mean, they provide a ton of different. Take a look at the website. They have a lot of different information that's easier. It's easy to digest. We send some of the cyber alerts and some of the products out to our suppliers as well. When we see things pop up that are relevant to them. So I think CISA, and you can probably talk way more on this, but it provides a lot of good information that's easily digestible and explains it well to the layman, which I think is important.
Yeah, well, first, thank you. Be prepared for CISA website 2.0, though. We're working on it to make it a little bit easier. But I think one of the things, and to kind of pivot off that, or kind of, you have to talk to people. And when you even look at this audience, who here is under 40? Doesn't look like many people. That's a problem. That's a problem. And, you have to get out there and talk. Part of being like on this panel or being a cybersecurity leader or an IT leader is you have to talk to people a lot more, and you have to get your people out there, and you have to get your people excited about things. And by people, I mean your entire organization, how it applies to them, how it, one of the big things we used to talk about at CBP, my family was like, well, what do you do there? It's like, we don't understand it. And it's like, we are integral to the protection of America, the supply chain, the food that you eat, and you need to your point, make it relevant for them. So when I was an airman many years ago, I didn't always understand the mission, and it was one person who told me, because I really made a big mistake. And when you're staying at attention in front of your lieutenant colonel, she took the time to explain to me the impacts that I had. And so I think a lot of your question comes back to leadership, helping people find the right information, and then making that information consumable. And that's something we're trying really hard at CISA. So we have very technical bulletins, but then we also have bulletins that are far more consumable, including like how to enable MFA on your social media accounts. That's a big deal. And so that's what we're trying to do at CISA. And I think it comes to exactly what you were saying. You need to present the information so that the person receiving it or the group receiving it cares about it and understands the impact to it, and keep it short.
This panel talked about, in our preparation before we came out to meet with you today, there is a large human element related to security, and we still keep looking for silver bullets and bits and bytes. And the leadership issue that Bob brought up is so important. The translation issue to the deck plate, if you will, which Courtney brought up, and then the innovation. How is that changing and maturing as you look at the supply chain? And so I'm really grateful that you all stayed and that you asked your questions. I'll go around the room if there's anything else or any final comments, but thank you very much for your time and attention today. Yes, sir.
Howdy, getting after the explaining the risk from the authorizing official to the commander. So I routinely have to stand in front of Admiral Richard at U.S. STRATCOM and tell him, sir, if you accept this risk, this is what's going to happen to your mission. And then my job is to recommend defensive cyber operations, internal defensive measures against that. So getting back to the software bomb and things like that, understanding the risks that the AO is accepting on behalf of the mission owner, something that my comment to recommend is, we have defensive depth, we can do a lot of things. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes time to understand, okay, this is the vulnerability. What do we have available within our cyber defense portfolio to mitigate the risk? If either the integrator or the software development factory or the third party itself says, hey, we know this is a vulnerability inherent within our software, and this is how you can either monitor it, respond to it in cyber incident handling or cyber response. That would help us paint that picture to the AO and then therefore to the mission owner. Just want to throw that comment out there.
Yep. Transparency. Yep. Right.
I think we've concluded today. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah.